A millionaire rescued a poor girl who was stealing to survive and took her to his house. When he returned from work, he was paralyzed upon seeing what she had done to his mother. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. Ethan Blackwood parked his sleek black Mercedes in the cobblestone driveway of his grand estate. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling mansion that sat atop the hills of West Ridge. To outsiders, Ethan's life was the picture of perfection, a successful businessman with wealth beyond imagination. But inside the cold walls of his home, Ethan lived in solitude, a shadow of his traumatic childhood lingering in every room. As he stepped out of the car, Ethan noticed a flicker of movement near the side gate. A girl, barely a teenager, darted across the lawn, clutching a loaf of bread and a small bundle of fruit from his grocery delivery. She was thin, with tangled hair and clothes that hung loosely on her small frame. "Hey! Stop!" Ethan called out, his voice firm but not harsh. The girl froze, her wide, fearful eyes meeting his. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt. Ethan approached her cautiously, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Look, I'm not going to call the cops," he said gently. "But you need to tell me why you're here." The girl hesitated, her grip tightening on the bread. "I was hungry," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to." Ethan sighed, seeing the raw desperation in her face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucy," she replied, her voice trembling. "Lucy," he repeated, his tone softening. "Come inside. You can't be out here like this." Lucy hesitated, her instincts telling her to run, but the weariness in her body won over. She nodded reluctantly, and Ethan led her into his home. The contrast was stark. The polished marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and walls adorned with priceless art were a world away from Lucy's life on the streets. She stood in the grand foyer, her shoes leaving faint marks on the spotless tiles. "Wait here," Ethan said before disappearing into another room. When he returned, he carried a tray with a sandwich, fruit, and a glass of water. He placed it on the coffee table and gestured for Lucy to sit. "Eat," he urged. Lucy devoured the food, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to take it away. Ethan watched silently, unsure of what to say. As Lucy finished her meal, an older woman entered the room. Margaret Blackwood, Ethan's mother, was a frail but graceful woman in her 70s. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her kind blue eyes softened when she saw Lucy. "Ethan, who's this?" Margaret asked, her voice warm. "This is Lucy," Ethan explained. "I found her outside. She needed help." Margaret approached Lucy with a gentle smile. "Well, you're safe here, dear. You must be tired. Let's get you cleaned up." Lucy looked at Ethan, uncertain. He nodded, and Margaret extended her hand. Lucy hesitated, but eventually took it. As Margaret led Lucy upstairs, Ethan stood alone in the living room, staring at the empty plate she had left behind. Something about her haunted eyes stayed with him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, an ache to connect, to understand, to protect. That night, as the mansion settled into silence, Ethan found himself replaying the encounter. Who was this girl, and what had life done to her? He didn't know it yet, but Lucy Hale was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Lucy's presence in the Blackwood estate was anything but seamless. Over the following days, her skittish demeanor and guarded behavior clashed with the orderly and controlled atmosphere Ethan had built around his life. Margaret, ever patient, worked tirelessly to make Lucy feel at home, but the young girl remained a puzzle, silent, watchful, and wary. It didn't help that the household staff viewed Lucy with suspicion. Whispers traveled through the grand halls about the girl who had entered their world uninvited. Carter, the housekeeper, was the most vocal about her disapproval. "She's trouble, Mr. Blackwood," she said one morning as Ethan reviewed work emails in his study. "Mark my words. Children like her don't just steal food, they take whatever they can get their hands on." Ethan looked up, irritation flashing in his dark eyes. "That's enough, Mrs. Carter. Lucy stays, and I expect the staff to treat her with respect. Is that clear?" Mrs. Carter pursed her lips, but nodded curtly before leaving the room. Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He wasn't naive. Lucy's arrival was far from conventional, but something about her vulnerability struck a chord deep within him. Meanwhile, Lucy kept to herself, wandering the estate cautiously. The luxury around her felt suffocating, a world so far removed from her own that it almost seemed like a dream. Margaret, determined to reach her, tried to include her in small activities, gardening in the mornings, baking cookies in the afternoon. Slowly, Lucy began to respond, her walls cracking just enough to let in slivers of warmth. One afternoon, Margaret handed Lucy a trowel as they knelt beside a bed of roses. "These were Ethan's father's favorite," Margaret said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He loved tending to the garden." Lucy glanced at the older woman, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What happened to him?" Margaret's expression softened, though a shadow passed over her face. "He passed away years ago. Ethan was just a boy. It was hard on both of us." Lucy hesitated before replying, her voice tentative. "I never knew my father. It was just me and my mum, until she was gone." Margaret placed a hand on Lucy's. "I'm sorry, dear. Loss is never easy, no matter how much time passes." The brief moment of connection didn't go unnoticed by Ethan, who observed them from a distance. He appreciated his mother's efforts, but his own reservations lingered. Lucy's story remained unclear, and there was a guardedness in her that suggested she wasn't telling the whole truth. One evening, Ethan confronted her as she sat on the back porch, staring at the fading sunset. "Lucy," he began, his voice calm but firm, "why were you stealing that day? Was it really just about the food?" Lucy stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edges of her borrowed sweater. "Why does it matter?" she snapped, her voice defensive. "It matters because you're here now," Ethan replied, crossing his arms. "And I need to know if there's more to your story than you're letting on." For a moment, Lucy said nothing. Then with a bitter laugh, she said, "You wouldn't understand. People like you never do." "Try me," Ethan said evenly. Lucy looked at him, her eyes hard and defiant. "I was hungry, okay? That's all you need to know. And if you don't want me here, just say it, I'll go." Ethan sighed, his frustration mounting. "No one's asking you to leave, but if you want to stay, you need to meet me halfway." Lucy didn't respond, her gaze fixed stubbornly on the horizon. Ethan left her alone, unsure if his words had reached her. Inside, Margaret watched the exchange from the window, her face etched with concern. "She's scared, Ethan," she said when he joined her in the living room. "You can't push her too hard." Ethan nodded, though unease lingered in his mind. Lucy's defiance wasn't just rebellion, it was fear, a shield she'd built against a world that had betrayed her time and again. What Ethan didn't realize was that her shield also hid secrets that could upend everything they thought they knew. Days turned into weeks, and Lucy's presence in the Blackwood estate began to take root, though uneasily. She was still wary, speaking only when spoken to and avoiding prolonged interactions with Ethan. Margaret, however, had a gentler touch. The older woman's patience and understanding began to wear down Lucy's walls, little by little. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself growing restless. The mystery surrounding Lucy gnawed at him. Where had she come from? Why was she so guarded? And most unsettling of all, why did certain details about her mannerisms feel oddly familiar? One rainy evening, while reviewing paperwork in his study, Ethan noticed Lucy lingering by the doorway. Her figure was silhouetted against the warm glow of the hallway light, hesitant to step inside. "Lucy," he said, setting his pen down. "What is it?" She shuffled her feet before stepping in. I need to ask you something," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "Go on," Ethan encouraged, leaning back in his chair. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't have to." Ethan tilted his head, considering her question. "Because you needed help," he said simply, "and because I've seen what happens when people like you don't get a second chance." Her gaze faltered, but she pressed on. "People like me." "Yes," Ethan said, his tone softening. "People who've been let down by the world. You remind me of someone I used to know." Lucy looked at him, her expression guarded. "Who?" Ethan hesitated. It was a memory he rarely revisited. "Someone who used to work here, a housekeeper. Her name was Maria." At the mention of the name, Lucy's face paled. She looked away quickly, but Ethan caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Do you know her?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "No," Lucy said too quickly. I don't." Ethan rose from his chair, stepping closer. "Lucy, if you know something, you need to tell me." "I don't know anything," she snapped, backing away, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Margaret entered the study just then, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Lucy looked between them, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "I need to go," she muttered, turning to leave. Margaret reached for her gently. "Lucy, please, whatever it is, you can tell us." Lucy froze in the doorway, her shoulders slumping. After a long silence, she turned back, tears welling in her eyes. "Maria was my mother," she admitted in a trembling voice. "She worked here years ago. She used to talk about this place, about you, Margaret, about Ethan. But one day she came home and said she'd been fired. She wouldn't tell me why, but I know it destroyed her." Ethan's breath caught. The pieces began to fall into place. The familiarity in Lucy's eyes, the bitterness in her tone when she spoke of people like him. "She passed away a few months later," Lucy continued, her voice cracking. "I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do. And then, one day, we lost the house, the little money we had, everything. I've been on my own ever since." Margaret's face was etched with grief as she listened. "Lucy, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We had no idea." Ethan's expression hardened. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" he demanded. Lucy glared at him through her tears. "Would you have cared? Or would you have thrown me out just like you did to her?" "That's not fair," Ethan shot back. "I was a kid back then. I didn't make those decisions." "Maybe not," Lucy retorted. "But this is your house, your family. You could have done something." The accusation stung and Ethan fell silent. Margaret placed a comforting hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Your mother was a wonderful woman," she said gently. "I don't know why she was let go, but I promise you we'll find out the truth." Lucy's shoulders shook as she cried, years of anger and grief pouring out at last. Margaret held her close, her maternal instincts taking over. Ethan watched, torn between guilt and a strange sense of responsibility. The revelation had shaken the foundation of their lives, but it was only the beginning. Ethan knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could uncover the truth. And in doing so, perhaps he could find a way to make amends, not just for Lucy's sake, but for his own. The following days were tense, marked by an uneasy quiet that settled over the Blackwood estate. Lucy's revelation hung in the air, its weight felt by everyone. Ethan, consumed by guilt and a need for answers, delved into the house's old employment records, searching for any mention of Maria Hale. His frustration grew as hours of searching turned up nothing. No termination notice, no complaints, not even a name. It was as if Maria had been erased from their history. Meanwhile, Margaret focused on building a bridge with Lucy. She spent hours with the girl, sharing stories of her own struggles and encouraging Lucy to open up. Slowly, Lucy's hardened exterior began to soften, though the pain of her past still lingered in every word she spoke. One evening, as the rain tapped against the mansion's grand windows, Margaret called Ethan into the sitting room. Lucy was there, her arms crossed defensively, but her gaze held a spark of determination. "She has something to say," Margaret said softly, taking a seat. Ethan nodded, sitting across from Lucy. "I'm listening." Lucy hesitated, her eyes flickering to Margaret before settling on Ethan. "I don't think my mom just got fired," she said. "She always said it was something bigger, something she couldn't talk about. She was scared, Ethan." Ethan leaned forward, his brows furrowing. "Scared of what?" Lucy shook her head. "I don't know. But before she died, she told me something strange. She said, 'They'll never forgive me.' I didn't understand what she meant, but now I think it has to do with this place." Ethan's stomach churned. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. "I'll figure this out, Lucy," he promised. "Whatever happened, you deserve to know." That night, unable to sleep, Ethan paced the halls of the mansion. His father's study, long untouched since his death, called to him. Pushing open the heavy oak door, he was met with the scent of aged leather and wood polish. The room was a time capsule, filled with relics of his father's meticulous life. Ethan sifted through dusty ledgers and old documents until he found an unmarked folder tucked inside a locked drawer. Breaking the lock, he opened it to reveal a collection of letters, contracts, and photographs. One photograph in particular made his breath catch, a group of staff members standing on the estate's lawn. In the corner stood a young woman with Lucy's same striking eyes, Maria. The letters told a fragmented story. Maria had uncovered an embezzlement scheme orchestrated by a senior staff member. Instead of being thanked for her honesty, she had been threatened into silence and ultimately fired to protect the Blackwoods' reputation. Ethan's father, desperate to avoid scandal, had swept everything under the rug. Ethan sat back, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Maria had been wronged, her loyalty punished, her life destroyed, and now her daughter had returned to the very house that had betrayed her. The next morning, Ethan confronted Margaret with the evidence. She read the documents with trembling hands, tears filling her eyes. "How could he do this?" she whispered. "Maria deserved so much better." "She did," Ethan agreed, "and so does Lucy." Together they decided to share the truth with Lucy. That evening, they sat her down in the living room, the folder resting heavily on the coffee table. Ethan took a deep breath before beginning. "We found out what happened to your mother," he said. "She wasn't fired because of anything she did wrong. She was trying to protect this family." Lucy's eyes widened, her hands clenching in her lap. "What are you talking about?" Ethan explained everything: the embezzlement, the threats, the decision to dismiss Maria. As he spoke, Lucy's face shifted from shock to anger to heartbreak. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "All this time," she whispered, "she was trying to do the right thing, and it cost her everything." "I'm so sorry, Lucy," Margaret said, reaching out to her. "If I had known—" Lucy pulled away, standing abruptly. "It doesn't change anything," she said, her voice breaking. "She's still gone, and I'm still alone." "No," Ethan said firmly, rising to meet her gaze. "You're not alone anymore. Whatever you need, whatever it takes, I'm here. We're here." Lucy hesitated, her defenses faltering. For the first time, she looked at Ethan not with suspicion, but with a glimmer of trust. Margaret stepped in gently. "Your mother's story deserves justice, Lucy. And so do you. Let us help." Lucy nodded slowly, tears still glistening in her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the night deepened, the three of them sat together, united by the weight of the truth and the promise of redemption. What none of them realized was that the storm they had just weathered was only the beginning. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of activity, emotions, and decisions. Ethan, determined to honor Maria's legacy and mend the wounds of the past, began taking steps to right the wrongs his family had committed. His first action was to reach out to the families affected by the embezzlement scandal, offering restitution where it was still possible. He also made it a priority to formally acknowledge Maria's sacrifice by dedicating a memorial garden on the estate grounds in her honor. Lucy, still grappling with the emotions stirred by the truth, watched Ethan's efforts with cautious hope. The guarded walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble, though trust was not something she could give lightly. Margaret became a steadying force, encouraging her to believe in the changes unfolding before her eyes. One evening, as the sun cast a warm glow over the estate, Ethan found Lucy sitting by the fountain in the garden. She traced her fingers over the engraved plaque, honoring her mother's name. "She would have liked this," Lucy said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness and gratitude. Ethan sat beside her, the weight of his actions still fresh in his mind. "It's not enough," he admitted. "I can't undo what happened to her. But I want to make sure you never have to feel that kind of loss again." Lucy looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Why do you care so much?" "Because I see you," Ethan said simply, "and because I know what it feels like to lose someone you love and feel like there's no one left to stand by you." For the first time, Lucy allowed herself to believe him. "Thank you," she said softly, her words laced with sincerity. But just as things seemed to be finding a fragile equilibrium, a new storm threatened to unravel everything. One morning, while reviewing estate records, Ethan discovered an anomaly. Recent accounts showing funds missing from the estate's charity initiatives. It didn't take long to trace the irregularities back to someone still within his employ, Mrs. Carter, the housekeeper who had so vehemently opposed Lucy's presence. Ethan wasted no time confronting her. In the grand foyer, with Margaret and Lucy watching, Mrs. Carter stood stiffly, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "You think you can just accuse me without proof?" she spat. Ethan held up the evidence, a detailed audit linking Mrs. Carter to the missing funds. "This isn't a question of proof, it's all here." Mrs. Carter's face hardened. "You brought this on yourself, Ethan. Taking in strays, digging up the past. It's made you soft. This house isn't what it used to be." "And thank God for that," Ethan shot back, his voice steady. "Pack your things. You're no longer welcome here." As Mrs. Carter left, her footsteps echoing through the mansion, Lucy looked at Ethan with newfound admiration. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't just wealthy, but principled, willing to fight for what was right. Later that evening, as the house settled into an uncharacteristic calm, Ethan approached Lucy with an envelope in hand. "I want you to have this," he said, holding it out. Lucy opened it cautiously, her eyes widening as she saw the papers inside. "This is a scholarship?" Ethan nodded. "Your mother sacrificed so much for this family, and you deserve the chance to build the life she wanted for you. The scholarship will cover anything you need. School, housing, supplies, it's yours." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied. "Just promise me you'll use it to chase whatever dreams you have." Overwhelmed, Lucy nodded. "I promise." As the weeks turned into months, The changes in the Blackwood estate were profound. Ethan's actions set a new tone for the household, one rooted in compassion and fairness. Margaret found a renewed sense of purpose, mentoring Lucy as she prepared to pursue her education. And Lucy, once a guarded and distrustful girl, began to blossom, her future bright with possibility. On a crisp autumn evening, the Blackwoods hosted a small gathering in the garden to officially unveil the Maria Hale Memorial Garden. Friends, staff, and members of the local community attended, drawn by the story of redemption and resilience that had unfolded within the estate's walls. Ethan stood at the center, his mother and Lucy by his side. "Today isn't just about remembering Maria," Ethan said, addressing the crowd. "It's about honoring the values she lived by: honesty, courage, and love. Her legacy has taught us that it's never too late to make things right, to be better." As the guests applauded, Lucy looked up at Ethan, her expression one of quiet gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. That night, as the garden lights cast a soft glow over the memorial plaque, Lucy sat beside Margaret, watching the stars. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Lucy asked softly. Margaret smiled, placing a hand on hers. "I know she would be." Inside the mansion, Ethan stood alone by the fireplace, gazing at an old photograph of Maria he had framed and placed on the mantel. He had made peace with the past, but more importantly, he had found a way to build a future. For Lucy, for his family, and for himself.